Alright, this is AP US History. We are online, continuing with our next lesson. Today's topic is dealing with foreign affairs during the Washington administration. There are going to be 4 different slides, and they are mixed in today with some pictures and some graphics. One of the first things we need to take a look at is what does foreign affairs actually mean. As you can see down at the bottom, foreign affairs is referring to any type of interaction with another country. So foreign affairs is dealing with a foreign country. Okay, so our first slide is dealing with taking a global position. The last thing that we talked about was George Washington becoming the president, being elected by the Electoral College, and setting up the government under the Constitution. So Congress set up the judicial branch of government, and Washington set up the executive branch of government, creating the different executive departments. Well, that was going on domestically here inside the United States, but at the same time that is taking place, there are events that are going on around the world that are going to have a huge impact on the United States as well. And the biggest by far was that the French Revolution was beginning over in France. Now, the French Revolution is going to be an internal event within France. It's not going to be like the American Revolution, where Americans were fighting against the British, who were the colonial power, and then America was the colonies of Great Britain. The French Revolution is an internal struggle within France over control of the country. There's going to be conflict between the French monarchy, the king, and those who wanted to have a republic in France. So the struggle initially is between French Republicans, those who want to have a republic, and against people who supported the French monarchy. Now, George Washington feels that the United States does not need to get involved with this, and so the U.S. doesn't. So nothing happens initially. In 1793, things get much more complicated because those French revolutionaries, those who were trying to have a republic instead of a monarchy, took it to a much higher level when they actually executed King Louis XVI. That is a huge step because it officially ends the monarchy, because you now have the king is dead. And this meant a lot of different things. First of all, it had a big impact in the United States because King Louis XVI had been the king of France during the American Revolution, so it had been his call to actually get involved in the American Revolution on the side of the United States. So a lot of Americans felt some amount of loyalty or fondness towards King Louis XVI because he had been the monarch of France during the American Revolution when France had been our ally. But perhaps the biggest issue is that Great Britain is going to declare war on France because they want to restore the monarchy. That's going to be a big issue for many European countries, particularly those who have monarchies, which is every country in Europe other than France at this point. If you are the monarch of a country around France, you don't want them to become a republic. You want them to stay a monarchy because you don't want your people to start thinking the same way the French were. You don't want your position as king to be threatened in any way, so you want to make sure every other country retains a monarch as well. So the big thing here is that there is now a war going on between Great Britain and France, and the United States is going to find themselves in the middle of it. So what's actually going on here in this war? Well, number one, the United States and France are allies, and we had an alliance with them all the way back to 1778. Hopefully you remember what the battle was in the Revolutionary War that convinced France to come and join into the conflict on the side of the United States. Of course, that was the Battle of Saratoga. So as of 1778, the United States and France have an alliance. So with France and Great Britain going to war, in theory, we're supposed to go to war also on the side of France. But the United States is still a very young, very weak country. And George Washington knows this, he realizes this, and he has to make a decision as far as what is going to happen. So what he decides to do is that instead of supporting the French, or instead of supporting the British, he is going to say the United States is going to be neutral. And he does this by issuing the Proclamation of Neutrality. And it is simply stating that the U.S. is going to remain neutral in this conflict. They are not going to pick any side. But he takes this a step further and says that individual American citizens should not pick sides either. Through their actions, through their commerce, they should not take a side. They should remain neutral. And that's going to be very controversial because a lot of people did feel like we should take one side or the other. Now, obviously a lot of Americans still had some degree of loyalty, of sympathy towards France because of the fact that France helped the United States during the Revolutionary War. But there were also a lot of people who supported Great Britain. Despite having the Revolutionary War not too far in the past, you still have to remember that most Americans had some degree of British ancestry. They had been British citizens. So there isn't a huge amount of animosity there, but more so, this is going to be a political issue because most Federalists at this time, the Federalist Party, most of them tended to be pro-Britain. Well, on the other side, most Democratic Republicans tended to be pro-France. So you have a war that's going on in Europe between France and Britain. Many Americans feel like we should get involved. The thing is, they can't agree on which side. You've got some people that say Britain and some people that say France. But Washington is going to take the stance of neutrality. He wants the United States to stay neutral in this conflict. Now, this was not an easy thing for the United States to do because there were a lot of things that were putting pressure on the U.S. to get involved. Obviously, both countries wanted the U.S. to get involved, and they made it very tough because one of the things that they would not allow is other countries trading with their enemy. So, from the perspective of Great Britain, if the United States is trading with France, that is not something they're going to allow. And the same thing applied with France. If the U.S. is trading with Great Britain, that's not something France is going to allow. And so what happens is both Great Britain and France start seizing American ships on the high seas. And they would seize the ships, take the cargo. They would take American sailors and try to impress them. And not impress them like, oh, let's show something that makes us look real cool. Impress meaning that they would take American sailors and force them to serve in their respective navies. So British ships might take American sailors and force them to work in the British Navy, or French ships would seize American sailors and force them to do the same thing in the French Navy. And there was very little we could do about it because we're still a young country. We don't have an army, and more specifically, we don't really have a navy. But George Washington, again, wants to keep us neutral. Why does he want to keep us neutral? Well, yes, we're young, we're vulnerable, but he is thinking in the long term. He knows that the population of the United States, both during the late colonial period and now that the U.S. is an independent country, the population is booming. It's growing very, very quickly. American families tended to have lots of babies, so as far as natural reproduction goes, the population is growing very, very quickly. He knows that if the U.S. can stay out of war with Europe for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, just for a generation or two, the U.S. will have a large enough population to where it will be able to defend itself, and it will be able to perhaps even be more assertive and more aggressive in the world. Right now, in early 1790s, the U.S. is not at that point yet. But if they can get into the future, the population will be large enough to where the U.S. will be able to assert itself that much more. So he is looking in the long term. Now, another thing that's going to challenge American neutrality is when the French sent over a person named Edmond Genet. So he is an official from France, and he came over to the U.S. He actually went to Charleston, South Carolina, and he was trying to drum up support for the French. So he was trying to go to individual citizens in the U.S. to try to get support for France, and this is just going to irritate George Washington, and even people who tended to be pro-France were angry about this. People such as Thomas Jefferson, when Genet was basically ignoring George Washington, stating that he needed to stop doing what he was doing. Even people like Jefferson said, "No, you don't insult the president like that." And then Washington eventually orders him to leave, and Genet does. So this neutrality is tested, but ultimately the U.S. does stay neutral. All right, so we've got two final points that we need to discuss before we end for today, and the first is dealing with the Jay Treaty. And the Jay Treaty is going to be negotiated with Great Britain. And basically it's going to try to acknowledge and deal with some of the issues that are remaining between the United States and Great Britain. Now, a couple of things this did. Number one, it got the British to agree to stop seizing American ships and stop impressing American sailors. And the forts that Great Britain controlled out in the Northwest Territory that they had held on to since the Revolutionary War, even though they weren't supposed to have that anymore, they promised that they would in turn give up those territories and stop holding on to those forts. They would leave. Now, they wouldn't totally do that, but they would promise to do so. And essentially what this does is it prevents there from being an immediate war with Great Britain. Things were very tense, and this is going to calm things down. A lot of Americans were unhappy about this because they felt that it didn't really get a whole lot from the British. It showed American weakness. But George Washington really advocated very strongly for the U.S. to go ahead and get this treaty. He worked hard to get it approved in the Senate because, again, he was trying to maintain American neutrality. He did not want the country to go to war. Now, eventually, we are going to go to war with Great Britain, but it's not going to be until after 1812, so it's going to give almost another 20 years for the United States to stabilize and grow before we do get back into a major war. But it's not going to happen in the 1790s because of Jay's Treaty. Moving on, the other major treaty that's signed during this time period is going to be the Pinckney Treaty. And the Pinckney Treaty is going to be agreed to with Spain. Now, Spain had been seeing that the U.S. was negotiating with Great Britain, and there was pressure on Spain now to negotiate with the U.S. as well because they didn't want there to be any type of alliance between between Great Britain and the U.S. So it kind of forced Spain to come to the bargaining table and to try to improve the relationship between Spain and the United States. And so the Pinckney Treaty is going to do two major things. The first is going to be it's going to set the official boundary between the U.S. and Florida. There had been some territory that had been disputed. If you're looking at the map right here on the slide, it's going to be that green territory at the at the bottom of the map in southern Mississippi, southern Alabama, at least present-day Mississippi and Alabama. That territory had been disputed. Under this treaty, that green territory would actually go to the U.S. But probably the most important thing from the Pinckney Treaty is it's going to open up the Mississippi River. Spanish had tried to bar the United States from bar Americans from getting on the Mississippi River because they closed it down at New Orleans. But the Pinckney Treaty is going to open up access to the Mississippi River to Americans. So that's the major thing with the Pinckney Treaty. All right, that is it for this lesson. If you have any questions, please post them on Facebook in the comment section, or you can just email me. Thanks, and that's it.